Hello and welcome from Monash University. My name is Viv Ellis and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Education. I'm speaking from the unceded land of the Kulin Nations on which Monash University was first built in the late 1950s. Through my teaching, research and service, I pay my respects to the Kulin elders past and present. Outside our faculty's building, where I'm standing now, is a public artwork by Megan Cope, a Quandanoka woman from Injerriba, Stradbroke Island in Queensland. The artwork is called Weelam Nalet, Our Place in the Woiwurrung language, which is the language of this land. The artwork is in several parts, centred around a bronze replica of a tarnuk, a water carrier, cast from an original in Melbourne Museum. As Megan points out, the original wooden tarnuk is so big and so heavy that it subverts the myth that Aboriginal people did not have permanent settlements. This tarnuk, or the original from which it was cast, marks a meeting place where people came together for refreshment, conviviality, and social interaction. Around the tarnuk in Megan's artworks are the words for welcome and hello in various Aboriginal languages. Those first words we say when we meet each other and offer hospitality to visitors and guests from other lands. Weelam Nalet is a marker of a living culture, the world's oldest living culture, a marker past which hundreds, if not thousands, of settler students and staff walk every single day, often without noticing and likely without feeling the responsibility of what it means to live and learn on someone else's land that was never ceded and very often still goes unacknowledged. It is an honour for us at Monash to host this event and to welcome our esteemed speakers and our audience today to mark the publication of the report from UNESCO's Commission on the Futures of Education, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. As UNESCO Director General Azalea points out in the foreword to the report, this last year and a half have reminded us all about our vulnerabilities in the present and our uncertainties about the future. But this moment also lends itself to the making of an opportunity for us to take rapid and radical action to change course in the ways we think about education and how we plan for the futures of education. In the way, as Bruno Latour has suggested, after lockdown, what kind of metamorphosis? And at the centre of this UNESCO report is an argument for a new social contract, one that, to quote, can repair injustices whilst transforming the future. As a university, and particularly as a faculty of education, we have a heavy responsibility to help build this new social contract for education by closely examining our own values and practices. We have a responsibility to ensure that all of us, students and staff, have our eyes and ears open to see and hear the lands on which we have settled, to recognise the legacies of colonialism and capitalism, and to ensure that as an educated person who has attended Monash University, we know this place, how and the extent to which it has become our place, and that knowing the world and being immersed in the world begins here on this land and with respect to this culture, and not by way of an aircraft to a European capital city. I hope you feel challenged and motivated by the discussion of this important report. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Jason Beech, who will be the chair and facilitator for this discussion today.
So thank you, Viv, very much for such a wonderful introduction. My name is Jason Beech. I am Senior Lecturer in Education Policy at Monash University, and I also hold a UNESCO Chair in Education for Sustainability and Global Citizenship at Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina. I will be the chair of this panel tonight, and I also want to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose lands we are gathered today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I want to welcome all the colleagues who are live streaming from different parts of the world. We have people from Australia, New Zealand, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Philippines, China, Oman, India, Fiji, UK, Italy, Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and the USA. So we are really starting a very big global conversation here, and thank you everyone for joining. I encourage you to join in the chat, and there will also be some polling, so I hope that you can all participate actively today. In this panel, we are going to discuss UNESCO's report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education that is a result of UNESCO's Future of Education initiative. This is a very relevant report for several reasons. First, because of the importance that UNESCO has in setting the agenda for global debates in education. UNESCO was created after the Second World War with a motto, "Since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed." Since then, it has worked to promote peace and global understanding throughout education and culture. The report we are discussing today follows in a long tradition of UNESCO's major reports that aim at redefining education, such as the Ferrari Report in the 1970s and the Delors Report in the 1990s. Many ideas in these reports have become part of the vocabulary that educators use on a daily basis when they think and they design their own practices. We can think of, for example, the ideas of learning to be, learning to know, learning to do, and learning to live together that are so much used all over the globe by educators and were the 4 pillars of education promoted by the Delors Report. The second reason that this report is very relevant is because UNESCO is not alone in promoting global debates in education. Global policy spaces have become very complex spaces in which very different kinds of institutions, such as international organizations, private for-profit corporations, global philanthropies, NGOs, universities, experts, exchange ideas and collaborate and compete to, in a way, promote global debates and set the agenda in education. As many of you know, with the creation of PISA in the 2000s, OECD has become the main reference in global education debates nowadays. The OECD promotes a market-oriented logic that places individuals as the focus of educational strategies and narratives about human progress and global understanding. In that sense, this report by UNESCO is an attempt by this organization to regain its leading position in global educational debates, but also an attempt to reaffirm its own humanistic perspective. Of course, the notion of a humanistic perspective is a dynamic and contested notion in itself, and I'm sure some of our panelists might comment on that later today. But it's also an attempt to balance the dominating market-driven logic that is prevalent in these global spaces. And that, of course, is a very important side to this report. Finally, the report is relevant because it addresses very important issues. It offers quite a grim diagnosis of the current situation of the world, where we have growing inequalities, weakening democracies, climate crisis, the challenges of disruptive technological changes, and of course, the pandemic that we are going through that has exacerbated many of these issues, and in particular, the issues of inequalities. Of course, that we all know that these challenges cannot be solved by education, but at the same time, it is very difficult to think that we can address these challenges without an educational strategy. Aware of this, the report calls for a new social contract in education and promotes a transformation of education for a better future. The proposals included in the report, of course, are open to discussion, to criticism, and in many ways to further refinement. What I think is most important about this report is that it is presented as a starting point of a global conversation that is very necessary. And here at the Faculty of Education at Monash University, we are starting this conversation. And for that, we have organized this distinguished panel of some of the best thinkers in education that have read the report and will share with us some of their impressions. I want to thank UNESCO for sharing with us early copies and helping us in organizing this panel. The panel will work as follows. We will start with Professor Noah Sobey. Noah played an important role in the Futures of Education initiative and in writing the report, and he's here representing UNESCO and will introduce the report. And then we will have 3 scholars for which I personally have huge admiration, comment on the contents of the report. We will start with Professor Susan Robertson from the University of Cambridge, who will be followed by Professor Fazal Rizvi from the University of Melbourne. And finally, Professor Raven Connell from the University of Sydney will close the panel with her thoughts. We will then have time for some questions from the audience, and hopefully we can start or continue the collective conversation that our panelists would have started. So I will now introduce our first presenter, that is Professor Noah Sobey. Noah is a researcher in comparative education and in the history of education at Loyola University in Chicago. He has been president of the Comparative and International Education Society of the US. He has also served on the executive committee of the International Standing Conference for the History of Education. His work, both in the history of education and in comparative education, is highly cited and of very high quality. Since 2019, he has taken leave of absence from his academic positions to join UNESCO as senior project officer. Thank you, Noah, for being here, and please, you can start.
Thanks very much, Jason. So I didn't mean to take the screen from you so quickly. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as Jason mentioned, I've had this extraordinary opportunity to be part of putting this together while on leave from a faculty position. So as many of you will know, UNESCO is the United Nations specialized agency on education. It embraces a humanistic approach to human development, which we'll talk more about. And over the past 2 years has been embarked on this pretty ambitious Futures of Education initiative that seeks to ask how we can best use knowledge and learning to shape the future of humanity and the planet. So what I'm going to do is quickly go through, I think, some of the high-level points of the report that hopefully be helpful for the discussion. Many of us are increasingly aware that the world is at a turning point. And in fact, if we're honest with ourselves, we know that more of the same, even if faster and more efficient, is propelling us towards a cliff. We face a choice. We can continue on an unsustainable path or radically change course. And though we'll discuss it, I mean, I think we know that education has great power to bring about change, and knowledge and learning are essential for any social transformation. But at present, the ways we organize education worldwide do not do enough to ensure justice, peace, a healthy planet. And in fact, some of our difficulties stem from how we educate. The primary argument of this new report is that we need a new social contract for education that can both repair past injustices while transforming the future. The report was put together over the course of 2 years under the leadership of the president of Ethiopia. She was joined by 17 other global thought leaders from different areas, different parts of the world, and they formed UNESCO's International Commission on the Futures of Education, which is an independent commission. But as important, the report was prepared through a process of co-construction and dialogue that engaged over 1 million people, again, from around the world. People offered their ideas in meetings, webinars, focus groups, through online platforms, polls, and surveys. And this broad, open, consultative process involved youth, educators, civil society, also governments, business, and many other stakeholders. As Jason mentioned in his introduction, this kind of visioning exercise is something UNESCO has undertaken at 2 previous moments. In fact, it's the third in a series of once a generation foresight exercises. The first of these, Learning to Be, from 1972, Jason referred to as the Ferrari Report, already warned of rising inequalities, emphasized the need for continued expansion, but also transformation of education, and one could argue, put the notion of lifelong learning on the global education policy agenda. Jason mentioned the Delors report from 1996. This latest report lays out an agenda for dialogue and action at multiple levels. But as Jason mentioned, it intends to be a starting point for ongoing debate, discussion, research, and action. The report begins with an assessment of the state of the world. Long-term trends show that we have come a long way in education in terms of educational access, learning outcomes, gender equality, but progress has been uneven, and many of today's gaps are based on the exclusions and injustices from the past. We're at a moment where, to many, things feel very out of balance, and we need to relearn our interdependencies, and we need to rebalance our relationships with one another, with the living planet Earth, and with technology. We also face a number of key emerging disruptions and uncertain futures that are explored in detail in the report. And they're emerging and uncertain because we don't yet know what will happen. Of course, the planet is in peril, but there is also great momentum to heal it. Democratic governance is under attack, but we also see citizen participation growing. Digital technologies don't always deliver, but they do have huge potential. In the world of work, ensuring that a human-centered world of work, ensuring human-centered work is getting harder, but of course, more attention is being paid to purpose and work that matters. Now, in each of these areas of disruption, it's important that education not only react, but that education play a role in shaping the futures we want. So the position that the Commission takes in its report is I think, one of hope. Despite the urgency of action, we have considerable reason to be full of hope. We have greater access to knowledge, to more tools that let us collaborate than ever before in human history. And education, the ways that we learning throughout life, have long played a role in the transformation of human societies. Education connects us with the world, to each other, exposes us to new possibilities, strengthens our capacities for dialogue and action. But to shape peaceful and just and sustainable futures, need to base our efforts on what we know and what we hope for. And there are three key questions that should be asked of education. What do we do now that we should continue doing? What are we doing now that we should stop doing? And what needs to be reinvented and creatively reimagined afresh? Now, these are questions that the Commission asked, but they're questions that need to be continually asked. The Commission's report proposes that renewing education requires building a new social contract for education. Sorry, I'm just going to move for better connection here, hopefully. And this can be done on three dimensions. One, in terms of foundational values. This means re-examining our implicit agreements on how we cooperate in organizing learning and knowledge for shared benefit. So we need to examine core values, the foundational principles embedded in our education system. We need to examine the design of education systems, how we set up schools, universities, and all the places and times that educational opportunities are present. And finally, forging a new social contract for education means also examining action and actors, the ways we build, maintain, and improve education, as well as who is involved in this. For foundational commitments, the Commission's report puts forth two universal commitments. One is that we must be committed to assuring and broadening the right to quality education throughout life. The right to education was established in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it needs to be safeguarded and strengthened to include people of all ages. And second, we must commit to strengthening education as a public endeavor and a common good. As a shared societal undertaking, education builds common purposes, enables individuals and communities to flourish together. And an emphasis on participation is what strengthens education as a common good, a form of shared well-being that's chosen and achieved together. In the words of the chair of the commission, these two universal principles must become foundational in education everywhere. And in this way, we'll be able to sustain and benefit from the rich tapestry of different ways of knowing and being in the world. The report itself goes into considerable detail on ways that we can attempt to and think about redesigning education, though it, as Jason mentioned in the intro, is very self-aware that these things need to be experimented with and tried and taken forward and improved by people differently in different parts of the world. But there are 5 key dimensions that need to be need considerable attention. In pedagogy, the way the relationships between learners, teachers, knowledge, competencies in the world, there's quite often in many places today a focus on teacher-driven lessons. Despite the fact that learners come together in the same space, efforts are largely directed at individual accomplishment. And the report proposes that in a new social contract for education, pedagogy should be organized around cooperation, collaboration, and solidarity. Currently, in many parts of the world, curricula are organized as a grid of subjects, and the report argues that instead we need to shift to emphasize ecological, intercultural, interdisciplinary learning. In many areas, in many instances, teaching is considered an individual practice, something that's conducted behind a closed classroom door. But the commission argues that we need to further professionalize teaching as a collaborative endeavor where the autonomy and freedom of teachers is supported and they become valued participants in public debates on the futures of education. The commission accords a significant role to schools. If the school didn't exist, it's something we would need to invent, but that doesn't mean that we need to just accept or be satisfied with the kinds of schools we have today. So the position of the commission in this report is that the school needs to be safeguarded and simultaneously transformed. And then finally, when we consider education at all times and spaces of learning, we need to move away from thinking about education as something that only happens in schools and only at certain ages, and instead welcome educational opportunities at all times and spaces. So each of these 5 dimensions is elaborated in a chapter in the report. I think the simplest way to tell the story of the report is to see it as a plan for rebalancing our relationships between each other, human, with nature and the planet, between and with technology. So alongside its calls for pedagogies of cooperation, the report emphasizes the need to treasure and sustain diversity and pluralism. It calls for the unlearning of bias, prejudice, and divisiveness. Also, the spread of information is a topic of particular misinformation is a topic of particular concern, and the report argues this needs to be countered through scientific, digital, and humanistic literacies. The report argues that the long-term action required to reverse climate change and environmental destruction requires a radical change in how we think about our relationships with nature, the capacity to live in harmony with our natural environment, taking no more than what is needed for our individual and shared well-being, is something to be learned through education. And the report argues that the ecological crisis that we face requires curricula that fundamentally reorient the place of humans in the world. Finally, the report gives considerable attention to our relationship to information, data, and knowledge, acknowledging that this has changed profoundly over past decades. I think the authors of the report see tremendous transformative potential in digital technologies, but clearly the digital transformation of education, as of our societies, needs to be steered to benefit all. And I think an important point on this is that while digital technologies are clearly transforming the work of schools and teachers, the report puts forth a strong argument that these technologies cannot and should not replace teachers in schools. Just about to wrap up here. Just how we build a new social contract for education is extremely important. The report calls for there to be a voice and a role for all. Everyone must be able to take part in reimagining our futures together. The report also recognizes the importance of research and calls for a worldwide collaborative research program that welcomes many different kinds of contributions. To achieve the transformation we clearly need stronger global collaboration and more equitable cooperation. And then finally, we need everyone, teachers, students, parents, school leaders, policymakers, civil society, government, to join in and make these transformations a reality in their school and community. So we're seeing a series of next steps. Quite importantly, this is an intervention in an ongoing global discussion. UNESCO is keen to promote discussions and debate about the report, and we're aiming for a global conversation that improves on it and allows us to build a new social contract for education together. I won't go into all these points, but I will just mention that we are encouraging through our national commissions and the over 250 partner organizations that helped us put together this report by doing focus groups and running events. We're encouraging people to take those 3 questions that I mentioned at the beginning and think about their own schools, their own communities, their own universities. So what happens in your school, your university, education in your community that should continue? What happens now that needs to be abandoned, and what needs to be creatively reimagined afresh? And I think it's through millions of us taking forward those ideas, as well as policymakers and the global policy community committing to taking up these ideas, that will achieve some change. The final point to mention is that this document is going to be one of the foundational documents for an upcoming UN summit on transforming education that's planned for New York in September of 2022. So thank you very much for the opportunity to do this quick presentation, and I'm looking forward to hearing people's comments and ideas.
Thank you very much, Noah. Thank you for a great synthesis of the report, and I want to appreciate and thank you very much, because I know it's very late or very early. I don't know where you are, so thanks for the effort. Now I'm going to introduce our first panelist that's going to react to Noah's presentation and to the report, really. She's Professor Susan Robertson. Susan is Professor of Sociology and Head of the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. She's also Fellow of Wolfson College, Distinguished Professorial Fellow at the University of Aarhus, and Distinguished Adjunct Professor at Beijing Institute of Technology. Susan's research engages with transformation of the state, the place of education politics and policymaking in those transformations, multi-scholars governance, teachers' labor, and social justice. She is the author of numerous books, journal articles, and book chapters, has held a portfolio of competitive grants from the EU and the ESRC, and is the founding editor and editor-in-chief of Globalization, Societies, and Education, and provided strategic leadership and policy advice on important social justice issues in education nationally and internationally. So thank you very much, Susan, for accepting our invitation, and we are eager to hearing what you have to say.
So thank you so much, Jason, for that wonderful introduction. Can I also say thank you so much to Noah for your presentation and to the organizers of this really important seminar. At the start, I want to actually say that it's such a refreshing change to encounter a semantic world of words like cooperation, compassion, solidarity, collaboration linked to the education enterprise, and the idea actually, not just that it should be a human right, I think that one's kind of fairly well cemented in there, but that education should be a public endeavour and a common good. And I think grasping back or grabbing hold of this idea that education is a public endeavour is going to be one of the most important elements of the strategy going forward. For too long, the lexicon of the world of education policy and practice has been determined by ideas like markets, global competition, entrepreneurship, consumerism, notions of public and private good, positional goods, and so on. So that kind of long list. Now, the title of the seminar today is Can Learning Shape the Future of Humanity and the Planet? But I kind of want to start off with a bit of a reminder that we did learn to become consumers. So learning is not something that at the kind of those more humanistically oriented or to the left actually embrace. Learning is something par excellence that the right has actually managed to capture for itself and advance a project that Richard Sennett, for example, would actually describe as creating and making the culture of the new capitalism. So there'll be major challenges ahead to advance this project and fundamentally trying to put back into the genie bottle here private interests and excessive individualism that's fundamentally characterized our societies over the past 2, 3, if not 4 decades. So those of us who are concerned about the kind of agenda that UNESCO has rolled out will be no doubt getting behind this report, but it's not going to be that easy to imagine how, for example, we move the ideas in this report into what James and Steger would actually describe as, moving it into the different levels of meaning formation, from an idea into an ideology, into thinking about social imaginaries, and fundamentally, and this is where we would need to go with this, into the ways in which we think and be and are in the world. In other words, our social ontologies. Now, UNESCO is a global governor, was created in the aftermath of the Second World War. Many of the elements that make up the way in which UNESCO functions came out actually of the First World War, notions of ideas that actually an intellectual community, if you brought them together, this is the League of Nations, could, with that degree of wisdom and reason, actually create the conditions for different kinds of conversations that might morph into a new social contract. But I want to say that there are major challenges ahead, and one of the issues facing UNESCO, as faces all of the international organizations, is the issue of governing and their authority to actually govern. And UNESCO's particularly found major challenges, in part because it does represent, unlike the OECD, all of the member states, all countries of the world are members. The OECD governs for a particular number of members, and yet has an awful lot to say about those who actually don't have membership, and does it through things like the development assistance portfolio and so on. So I want to reflect back a little bit on that longer history that Noah has introduced also, moments in history where essentially the future is actually up for grabs. And it is that specifically international organizations govern through trying to capture a sense of what the future might be and use devices, much as this particular report has done, to capture the future. So the future itself is a political resource. And what I want to do is I want to reflect on what anticipatory governance actually means in the case of UNESCO, as it does for all of the international organizations. Securing the future as a political resource fundamentally means that it needs then to overcome the problems of not having sovereignty, but then deriving its authority from the fact that it is a legitimate governor. And yet that is also marked with huge challenges, as Jens Beckett would actually describe, because it depends then on promissory legitimacy. In other words, it's promises that a future that it has actually carved out can actually emerge and can actually be delivered. So it will always be in the balance for UNESCO as to what that future, when it arrives, what that future actually begins to look like. Now, another problem facing UNESCO, and something I've been writing about, is that it governs through what I've called a philosophy of the future. In other words, it's very explicit about the kinds of values that it actually sees that it wants to foster. Historically, its values have been, when it first started, a science, essentially a philosophy of the future, was this idea of a world society, and that all societies, all countries around the world, all territories around the world would be moving off in the direction of some kind of world society, of which, in this particular case, as it begins its work, the West was regarded as the most developed, and arriving at this particular kind of point. This was essentially a highly racist project, because those who were left behind, who were kind of on the escalator kind of moving forward, were often typically regarded as, you know, underdeveloped, and so on. Now, that conception of UNESCO was challenged, and it has actually moved away from this determined kind of view of development and those who are underdeveloped and those who in fact might arrive at this prefigured kind of destination. But nevertheless, it has always moved forward with this idea of a philosophy of the future. By way of contrast, what we see is the OECD actually works through a science of the future. In other words, it works with probabilistic calculations, uses scenarios, foresight, and so on. But fundamentally, it buries, it hides its values. The politics and values are still there, but it hides them underneath economic statistics and the idea that it's actually objective. So historically, I would say that, and we see these with these 3 reports now, with the latest report that we're actually looking at today, as emerging at moments what Anne Miches would describe as sites of projectivity. In other words, there's a heightened sense of a need to debate the future and debate possible futures. So here we are again in the beginning of the 3rd decade almost of the new 21st century, with UNESCO again stepping into the fray and offering us a future and asking us to get behind that future. But for the moment, this is a conversation, and my sense about this conversation is that it's going to need more behind it, and very likely more behind it in actually engaging and naming some of the major issues that have developed the inequalities that the kind of techno-science world that par excellence the tech companies are actually getting behind. So let me just reflect then on some of the issues that I actually see with the report. I welcome, I'm sure everyone welcomes, the promise of this report to think about notions of compassion, to think of ideas like cooperation and so on. But it's not been for the first time that UNESCO has actually done that. To some extent, the FOR report did that, although stopped short of actually naming capitalism in part for its role or its complicity in generating these kinds of inequalities. For the FOR report, essentially, it was a variations in culture, values, paths, and goals. And yet fundamentally, we know that essentially in the 1970s, we saw a crisis, the oil shocks, a major crisis of development for the so-called developed countries, and then kind of engaging with what kind of path forward in terms of an economic project. Later in the 1990s and the Delors report, probably more assertive here in terms of reflecting on the economic nature of the agendas shaping education, and actually asking at that particular moment in the 1990s that actually our economic growth model could in no way actually continue. Again, picking up some elements of the debate around, degrowth, the limits to growth, that actually indeed elements of the OECD had actually named and embraced in the 1960s and 70s. So what happens when future presents arrive, as we see at the moment, and the promise of the future is not equally shared, and where international organizations like UNESCO confront a shortfall in promissory legitimacy, much as it's looking at the present and looking into the future. So UNESCO has been confronted with a crisis of promissory legitimacy in ways in which, and largely tied to the idea and strong kind of commitments to notions of modernity and so on. So how can UNESCO move away from the dominance of a particular knowledge project? So it's one thing to talk about learning, and I suspect that Raywin might take us out into that conversation, but it's another to actually put in the center the knowledge project, modernity, modernization, that forward momentum, and pull back. What would it mean to think about degrowth, for example? Ideas that are mentioned, but actually even this particular report doesn't really name the dependence of capitalism on this kind of forward momentum, on degrowth, the challenges of degrowth. So the International Commission on the Futures is an effort actually to put something else on the table. The idea of compassion, the idea of cooperation is actually sorely needed. The invitation to have a conversation across cultures, political divides, chasms of deep inequality and different technological resources. And they presume a willing, literate citizen and civic spaces that can recover a sense of the public. And yet what we know is that we have actually lost, there's been an erosion of these civic and public spaces in the face of rampant authoritarian populism around the globe, and a sense that these kinds of spaces, it's not just the conversations, but it's actually a recovery of the notion of a public and a civic community. So in conclusion, I embrace the sentiments of the report, but I actually, looking at past reports and their promises, have doubts about the capacity for UNESCO to actually pull it off, not least because its authority is not derived from the kind of sovereignty that Rousseau imagined the question of rule needed in order for governing to take place through the social contract. In other words, the Westphalian system, which is actually reinforcing itself, grabs onto the social contract, and the international organizations have actually found it hugely challenging to generate any degree of authority, and it's largely been in the direction of trying to claim the future. What I think we need is a very strong set of conversations, rather like those that Eric Olin Wright is asking us in Realistic Utopias to engage with. Conversations that actually really do get at the heart of social and political justice around redistribution, recognition, and representation, to actually put on the table the challenge to capitalism on the one hand, and to decenter more assertively than I think the report's actually doing, the idea of modernity and its knowledge project. How can we actually draw on the work, for example, in this particular moment of redistribution, recognition and representation, the work of Nancy Fraser, in ways in which it actually has the ideational impact, but actually has the material, challenges the kind of material conditions that I would want to argue have actually created the current crisis that we're actually looking fairly and squarely at the heart of. So can we go forward with the beginnings of the conversation that UNESCO has actually placed on the table, but can we actually make it a much more assertive conversation around the challenges that we're presented with to do with capitalism and to do with modernity? In other words, multiple knowledges, and multiple knowledges not to do with civilizational projects, but knowledges around different ways in which our economic worlds can actually work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan, very much for those thoughts. Really, really interesting, and as I've expected, and a lot more to think about. Now I will invite Professor Fazal Rizvi to join us. Fazal is an emeritus professor of global studies in education at the University of Melbourne, as well as at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He has written extensively on issues of identity and culture in transnational contexts, globalization and education policy, and Australia-Asia relations. His book, co-authored with Bob Lingard, Globalizing Education Policy, is used widely in courses around the world. A sequel to this book, Reimagining Globalization and Education, is currently in print. He's currently researching educational reform in Bhutan. Fazal is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Social Sciences, a past editor of the journal Discourse, Studies in Cultural Politics of Education, and past president of the Australian Association of Research in Education. Fazal, all yours.
Thank you very much, Jason. I am very pleased to have this opportunity to share some of my ideas, having read the report over the past few weeks. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the land of Wadawurrung people of Kulin Nation, just south of Geelong, and I pay respect to the elders present, past, and future. Now, in many ways, I think there is something very familiar about the latest UNESCO report. Like UNESCO's earlier educational blueprints, such as the Fuor and Dolores reports, this report too is highly ambitious and perhaps even utopian. It reaffirms some of the key principles that stretch back to the UNESCO's origins in the 1940s. And while its ambitions invoke a certain universalism, it, like other reports, is also deeply conscious of the need to take seriously the local conditions, the local specificities, and the local requirements. Now, at least 6 normative principles have been central to UNESCO's work in education over the years, including its very many reports. Its continuing focus on humanism, a belief in our shared humanity. And that, of course, is a contested topic and has become more so in recent years. Its view of education as a universal right articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Its unshakable faith in the potential of education to address social, economic, and political crises that the world faces. Its emphasis on the importance of international collaboration and cooperation. Its commitment to expanding access to education conceptualized as public endeavor and a common good, and its consistent support for teachers and schools and the professionalization of their work. Now, each of these recommitments are welcome and is welcome. And indeed, in my view, this report presents these commitments with greater clarity than perhaps earlier reports have done. These notions can be found in all of these reports, but the ways in which they have interpreted and articulated these ideas have not been static and have changed over the years. In the new report, these ideas have acquired new meaning, new significance, and new urgency. The report highlights the need to look back at what has and has not worked in the past, but is equally ready to identify the emerging challenges, if you like, the emerging challenges, sometimes the characterization of which is highly, highly controversial. But the report itself does not draw back from naming those challenges, which I think is something to be welcomed. And it is also interested and is committed to pointing to the new possibilities without saying that these are some universal panacea to the problems that we face. And it therefore says something really quite useful and quite important about how we need to work towards more productive, more equitable futures. Now, like UNESCO's earlier reports, this report too puts an inordinate amount of faith in the potential of education and learning to overcome some of the most serious challenges. In its earliest days, these challenges, of course, related to post-war reconstruction and to the post-colonial nationalist aspirations of the newly independent countries. The focus of the Ferrari Report in the 1972 was on the role of education in national economic development. It was a report that wanted to reaffirm the role that nation states play in making sure that the challenges of extreme poverty and persistent levels of inequality and educational and social inequalities are addressed. It encouraged colonial powers to recognize their responsibilities to the countries they had once exploited and colonized. Now, in the early 1990s, in contrast, the Dolores Report was much more concerned about the shift that were taking place with rapid economic and political changes and the various crises that were emerging and that were clearly evident. The solution was to a certain extent collective, but largely concerned with individual environment. And as I read back at Dolores' report, the liberal individualism of the report became more and more clear to me, perhaps in ways that it was not when I first encountered it some 30 years ago. Now, each of the Ferrari and Dolores reports, a great deal was expected of educational systems, of teachers, and of schools. However, each of these reports were relatively silent in their understandings of the broader context in which education takes place and the various socioeconomic factors that prevent education from realizing its potential. So, for example, it was relatively silent in what Mignolo calls colonial modernity of the 1990s and early 2000s, and yet it assumed that education can somehow sort of drive past the legacies of colonial modernities and the ways in which colonialism continues to influence the possibilities of educational and social change. This report too highlights the potential of education to meet the multiple crises we face, including, of course, the ecological emergency, growing levels of inequality, health insecurity, the changing nature of work, challenges associated with the new technologies, and the global rise of populist nationalism. It recognizes how these historical transformations pose major and enormous challenges. But what is not adequately recognized in this report is how, paradoxically, some of these very transformations themselves pose a direct challenge to educational systems and the potential for change. Contemporary expressions of populism, for example, have kindled distrust in knowledge institutions, in science, and in higher learning. Progressive teachers, for example, have been branded elite, self-interested, and self-absorbed. And yet, these distrusted institutions and people are precisely the people that are being now asked to challenge those who have opposed to their work over the past 2 decades. And there is a fundamental, if you like, a dilemma, or certainly a tension that exists at the heart of a proposal that expects a great deal from education while recognizing that education itself is not getting a very good press right now, and that there is a great deal of distrust in educational institutions. Now, the question arises then as to how the faith in educational systems, and particularly its public character, might be restored. Similarly, the new technologies have tremendous transformative potential, but it also has the capacity to exasperate some of the very serious problems we face and some of the very educational initiatives that we might take, consolidating deep fractures within and across communities, preventing us from working collaboratively. So while collaboration is encouraged, there is also the problem of the very conditions that prevent collaboration and cooperation, especially in the context of capitalism and colonial modernity and the asymmetries of power that exist within our world. For education to meet these global challenges, and should I use the term contradictions, the report revives the old an old idea in political philosophy, and that is the idea of social contract. Education, it says, can be seen in terms of a social contract, an implicit agreement between members of society to cooperate for shared benefits. This does not mean, the report insists, a transactional relationship, an instrumental utilitarian relationship, but a relationship that reflects norms, principles, and commitments that are not formally legislated, that are not only formally legislated, but are also culturally embedded. Now, what are these norms, principles, and commitments? And where do they come from? And how can we establish their veracity and their relevance in the contemporary age of growing levels of inequalities and asymmetries? In other words, what is the potential of forging a social contract? And with whom do we forge this contract? And who are the parties to this contract? And whether the language of contract itself is inappropriate or indeed problematic, as many political philosophers from Carol Pateman to others have pointed out. The answers to these questions are somewhat unclear in this report, I suppose, because these are ideas that need to be debated, need to be deliberated over. However, it is quite clear that the report places a huge amount of analytical and political weight on the promissory concept of social contract. It suggests that instead, that while elements of social contract already exist, others need to be forged. In other words, it does not have a fixedly teleological view of social contract. It doesn't know what the ultimate end of social contract is, but nonetheless, it promises and encourages a journey towards a social contract. In other words, processes of collaboration towards a contract are much more important than the contract and its content itself. Okay. In education, such a contract requires, it says, the development of a shared vision of public purposes of education. To do so, it underlies the importance of collaborative research based on the principles of global solidarity and international cooperation. The report insists that it's essential that everyone should be able to participate in what it called catalyzing a social contract. The notion of catalyzing is really quite an interesting one, and I think something that we might think about and debate. Now, as rhetorically attractive as the idea of social contract is, it is not clear as to how and where this contract might be negotiated. The report seems to suggest that the new social contract needs to be negotiated at every level of society, from local community to educational institutions to global organizations themselves. In other words, the social contract needs to be forged, if you like, between the World Bank and UNESCO, for example. At each of these levels, we need to acknowledge that the established ways of thinking about education, knowledge, and learning have prevented us from opening new paths and moving towards the futures we desire through attempts to define the contours of the common good. This requires cooperation and collaboration, but in ways that remain firmly rooted in a commitment to human rights. A social contract for education thus needs to be based on a broad-based, inclusive, and democratic dialogue and mobilization to realize it. The report views itself as providing the coordinates of this invitation for this dialogue. The coordinates are firmly rooted in UNESCO's foundational commitment to humanism. And yet the organization has never been able to articulate a consistent position on humanism. The ideal person or the personhood itself is a philosophical notion that has not been able to be defined clearly. As members of state coming from very different cultural, epistemic, and ontological traditions have repeatedly contested the Western Enlightenment traditions within which humanistic ideals have often been expressed. So, for example, objections to the universalism of the Enlightenment thinking on humanism led UNESCO's first Director General, Julian Huxley, to propose a form of scientific humanism, what he called evolutionary humanism, based on his understanding of evolutionary biology. Over the years, however, it has become clear that this view of humanism too assumes a particular view of human capacities and dispositions, which view human conditions differently with respect, for example, to the relationship between humans and nature. In other words, different civilizational traditions view this relationship differently. So exactly how we should collaborate across these differences of ontological, ethical, and epistemic kind becomes really a very important issue. Now, this report has been written against the background of a growing awareness of the environmental crisis and the world that the world faces. Indeed, it is quite significant that the report was launched on the 10th in the midst of the Glasgow deliberations. And whatever you think about it, it really is quite significant that the two agendas are being brought together. Its recognition of Anthropocene is absolutely clear. The report acknowledges the complexities of the relationship between humans and nature, out of which the idea of sustainability now needs to make sense. Now, all this is widely recognized, but it does not say very much about how human systems, including education, should address this relationship. Perhaps we, as humans, do not only need to have a contract with each other, with our human societies and human communities and human civilizations, but with the natural world itself, so that we do not continue to destroy it. In other words, we need to actually do much more work on the idea of social contract. It is a seductive notion. It is an interesting notion, but I think in the report itself, it only provides a promissory indication of what it might mean. We need to do the work that it has left us to do now going forward. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Fazal, very much for those wonderful ideas, and again, a lot more to think about. I would like, and of course, we can pick up on many of the ideas put forward by Susan and Fazal in a few minutes when we open up to questions and comments from the audience. I will now call in Professor Raven Connell, and I will introduce her. Raven is Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney and life member of the National Tertiary Education Union in Australia. She has taught in several countries and is a well-known sociological researcher. Her work has been translated into 22 languages. Her 5 books on educational issues include Making the Difference, Schools and Social Justice, and The Good University. Raven has been active in the labor movement and in work for gender equality and peace. You can find more details of her work at her webpage, ravenconnell.net, and discuss with her in Twitter and at Raven Connell. So Raven, thank you very much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you to all the people who've come to this discussion. I'm speaking to you from Sydney in Australia, and I would like to acknowledge that this is country traditionally the lands of the Eora and Darug peoples on which the city is now built, and that this was land never ceded in the process of colonial conquest that created contemporary Australia. I've had, like I think the other speakers in this session, an interested time reading an interesting document, one that tries to peer into the future and also offer a critique of the present. Writing an international report, or a report that's intended to circulate globally, is a difficult thing to do, for sure. And doing it for UNESCO, perhaps particularly difficult, because UNESCO has been an embattled organization in recent decades, under attack by the political right, especially from the United States, struggling often for adequate funding, and somewhat overshadowed by better funded organizations with themselves a global education agenda, such as the World Bank, and as Susan reminded us, the OECD. There are things that I found very attractive and inspiring in this attempt at a global vision of education. It does have a genuinely world view, which isn't always the case in international documents. It's strongly aware of global inequalities, of the historical impact of imperialism, and of the forms of inequality that survived the end of the political empires and have taken a new lease of life in the last 30 or 40 years. So it's aware of the precarious economic situation of much of the world's population now. It's aware of the different forms of knowledge, different knowledge formations that exist in the world that Fazal reminded us about too. The report has got a very strong sense of environmental crisis, and of course that makes its release very timely, just when we're all agonizing over or suffering from the debacle of the climate meeting in Glasgow, COP26, and particularly the disgusting performance of the Australian government at that event. It's just really sets one back on one's heels. It's interesting, I think, in trying to work out the implications of environmental crisis for education, something that many educators have been aware of and have struggled to find a way of bringing into educational thinking and educational practice. And the report does this both at a kind of technical level, but perhaps most profoundly at a moral level, by talking about the responsibilities that we now have in relation to environment and the desperate need for concerted collective action to respond to it. The report is also noteworthy and encouraging in its attempt to speak to the moment, to be relevant to the historical moment that we find ourselves in, long past the Cold War, though there are still, of course, people around fighting it, in an era of pandemics, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which is still running, the COVID pandemic of the last couple of years. Woven through the report are consciousness of this historical moment, of the shifts in technology, a word I'm not entirely comfortable with, but which is the popular language, talking about new forms of communication and new forms of power that go with them. The report speculates a bit about the impact of neuroscience on education, an issue that is still to be proven, but is indeed possible. And the report doesn't flinch from naming issues like racism and sexism as very significant hindrances to constraints on an inclusive humanist perspective on education. So those are things I admire about the report, and I think the team that wrote it have done well to bring those kinds of themes together and to make a thoroughly interesting story out of it. There are other things I'm a little more worried about. The report brings these issues together by using a high rhetorical tone pretty much throughout. So we start out by hearing about the planet in peril. The report declares right at the start that we, and that's a problem as to who exactly the we might be, but at all events, we face an existential choice in which the planet in peril is at stake and human life for the future. Now, I'm not contesting the underlying truth of that observation, but there is a certain language, a certain rhetoric which the report has adopted that has some problems associated with it, which I'll bring up a little later. So the report speaks a lot about what must happen, what we ought to do in making rather grand gestures, and sometimes one has to stop and think, who is the we who are going to do this and that, and is there the possibility of anyone thinking that there might be other musts than the ones discussed? I guess my feeling about the tone and assumptions of the report slightly different from Fazal's. I saw it not so much as an expression of classical humanism, but of a progressive liberal perspective that is well familiar in education circles. It's the Deweyan, or perhaps the progressive, more progressive side of the Deweyan tradition. I was struck, for instance, that the report offered as its kind of philosophical and political foundation the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And a rights-based political philosophy does have a certain location in the philosophical world, a certain underlying association with individualist notions, which is attractive in many situations and perhaps weak in some others. The report has a view of education that I guess I would see as at least implicitly child-centered and therefore squarely in the progressive education tradition. It's concerned with what my generation of educational called relevant curriculum, relevant and meaningful curriculum. That's a strong presence in the report's treatment of environmental issues, but also social issues, racism, sexism, and so forth. So there are things where there are parts of the report, I think, where these bases and this language works quite well. I think there's a good chapter. The chapter on teachers was, for me, the one of the highlights of the report. I wonder if there was a little union input into that. I hope so. The report is interesting and I think perceptive in talking about the social life of schools, the importance of the social life of schools in educational process. And when it gets to the issue of technology, over which many educators seem to lose their critical sense, it keeps its own critical sense, so that there are nice observations there on the fragility of the private platforms, the platform capitalism, as it's sometimes called, illustrated by Facebook and so forth. So there are strengths in this report. There are things that will make it worth studying and worth working on, worth working with. But I think there are also some weaknesses in it. Without wanting to trash the efforts of intelligent and committed people over 2 years, I think we also need to recognise some of these. I think at moments the report approaches it being politically naive. It's certainly intending to influence education policy and the institutions that develop and apply education policies. But there's little treatment in the report of the policy process or those institutions themselves, state departments of education, international organizations like the World Bank. These are not concretely treated in the report, and therefore the policy implications float a little bit in the air. When the report comes to the big question of, what's the source of all the mischief, or what is causing the difficulties, it becomes pretty vague. So, for instance, we're told that the dominant economic models are sort of the villain for the rising inequality and the environmental impact and so forth. And I don't find that actually very credible. We don't find in the report concrete treatment of the transnational corporations, which are indeed serious actors in producing the contemporary troubles of the world. There isn't a concrete treatment of the corporate takeover of significant public arenas, including education policy making. It doesn't, although it has a general assumption of a kind of democratic collectivism, it doesn't concretely at any point confront the rise of authoritarian regimes, the emergence of dictators as a major dictatorships as a major political form in the contemporary world, and the predictable hostility of very powerful political regimes to the kind of agenda that the report wishes to advance. Like Fazal, I found serious difficulty with the report's notion of a social contract. I agree there must be some compacts, some coalitions, some political determinations and decisions behind a program of educational change. But whether that's usefully thought of as a contract, I very seriously doubt. The report gives no account of who are to be the parties to the contract, as Fazal remarked. And equally importantly, I think it gives no account of the political process by which agreement to a contract could be reached, support for the report's agenda might be mobilized and turned into actual educational decisions and process. So in these ways, I thought, in this area, I thought the report had its weaknesses. And that, to me, I suppose, is where I wind up, because I'm left at the end of the day with the question, can we do better on that front? The framework of the report I find attractive. The progressive liberalism, I suppose, is the tradition that my educational thinking came out of, and most that I've seen that's good in modern education has developed from. So I have no real contest with the framework of thinking about education that the report advances. But I am troubled by the question of the way that it might be turned into reality. I think we also need a mode of thinking, and whether, a generalized report to an intergovernmental organization is the way to do this, is debatable, because implicit in that genre, given an intergovernmental organization like UNESCO, there are constraints and difficulties and compromises that must be reached. But at all events, I think we need a process of thought and action that is closer to the chalk face than much of the content of this report gets. We need thought and action that is tougher about issues of political power and is more concerned with the on-the-ground organising, whether that means unions, social movements, or new forms of popular and mass education itself, the on-the-ground work that is necessary to move from the dire situation we're in to the better educational future that this report is hoping for. So those are my thoughts, and I'll hand back now to our chair and hope that we have good space for people to bring up questions, counter-arguments, and debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Raven, very much for those wonderful ideas. Please stay with us, and I invite all of the panelists, including Noah, of course, to join me. And we will now get questions or comments from the public, from the audience. Again, I think it has been a wonderful response from all of you, and so many ideas to think about. So here we have the first question coming from the. Here comes the first question coming from the audience. It says, I would like to ask the panelists how they think that the report will influence actual educational policies and practices, and what needs to be done to move from the abstract level to something more practical. So a lot in the direction of what Raven was just saying. Anyone in particular wants to take this up?
Well, it might be interesting to get Noah's view first as to what is being planned, from here onwards, and whether there are some mini reports that are going to come out of this mega report that will address some of these issues.
Okay, so let's hear Noah first, and then Raven will have your views also, and then of course if any Susan or Fazal want to add anything, more than welcome.
Well, I mean, clearly, well, thank you for those really thoughtful comments on the report and on the process and suggestions on all the ideas. You know, as Fazal said, with regard to the social contract, that, you know, and Raywin as well, there's much more that needs to be worked over. And, you know, the report does not pretend to be a blueprint, certainly does not pretend to be the final word, nor does it pretend to be, you know, the magic bullet that will help us take everything forward. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. You know, in terms of politically mobilizing on this, I mean, I think we have to move on all levels. I mean, I think there's, I suggested in my closing that, you know, thinking about the task of renewal is something that can be done at multiple levels. I also think, as was pointed out, that kind of working on compacts and coalitions, and, you know, the relational dimension of a social contract also needs to be done on multiple levels, you know, including at the intergovernmental, international, global level, and on very local levels. You know, so far the reaction from UNESCO member states has been very positive. You know, a lot of interest in carrying forward the ideas in the report. Although, as the speakers have pointed out, you know, UNESCO has to write and from a particular position, although this is an independent report, and comes in that way. I think it, you know, this also joins a larger commitment within the UN system to thinking about, you know, how we form agendas, how we form a common agenda, and how we kind of remake the social contract globally. But full agreement that needs more work. I mean, I think some people have correctly pointed out that some of the sharpest points are around teaching and learning, and that the vision of change that can be affected by work in those areas, I think is one of the stronger pieces. But organizing the regional dialogues, the sub-regional dialogues that need to take place on this is ahead for us. So over to you, Raywin, then.
Sure. This is the $64 question, isn't it? I think policy documents rarely make things happen. What they mainly do is give people language, ways of thinking, and sometimes permission to do something that they want to do, and have some ideas about doing. And that hopefully this document can do some of that, giving a language, for instance, about, as you say, about teaching and learning, or about teachers and learners, and the collective dimension of learning which is recognised in the report. It's very important. And can give permission even to governments to think in a more progressive way than the permission they will get from the OECD or the various, you know, predatory corporations that are hanging around the education scene at the moment. In terms of how we get get the ideas such as this into practice, well, it involves a hell of a lot of organising, and, you know, I ended on that note. How support can be generated from below, through unions, through social movements. And the materials from these reports can, you know, be of use to worker organisations and social movements, especially if they're prepared in ways that make them easy to use. They may also be attractive, and I'm glad that you've got some feedback from member states, because there must be quite a lot of member states of the United Nations at the moment that are deeply disillusioned at the recent process, for instance, at COP26. And which would like to have a kind of, at least intellectual permission to go on a different track somehow. And that I hope, is one of the good effects that a report like this might have.
Jason, can I come in and comment? I actually think we need something equivalent to, let's say, a COP26 if it went well. And to think about how the commitments that have been made around, for example, the SDGs. So what would a reworked set of SDGs begin to look like that actually took this report seriously? UNESCO's never been short of ideas. I mean, that's fundamentally, since its beginning, even the notion of the Ideas Lab, a global conversation. But he's always found that final bit of actually how to take something and ensure that in practice these things become different. And it's in part because, in fact, fundamentally, and this is the issue with the social contract, Rousseau's social contract basically says, if we cede some of our sovereignty, some of our natural liberties, and we actually adopt civil liberties, placing us all in the same boat together, so this is the sovereignty question, then we'll give some of that authority up for protection, fundamentally. Now, how might we make something like that work at the level of the nation state? And so, to some extent, some kind of, and I'm not sure. I mean, I've been somewhat pleasantly surprised at some moves that the OECD has been making most recently. For example, if you take a look at the major kind of annual conference on the teaching profession, along with Education International, they've moved off with a slightly different kind of conversation there. So my sense is that really it's getting governments to make strong commitments financially, because this is where UNESCO has always fallen over right from the get-go, that national governments never had the kinds of resources, and it was very kind of spiky. Some did, some didn't. Typically the United States has pulled out. The UK has often been in there as well. So unless there's financial resource on the table to actually influence national, subnational education systems, it will ultimately end up in the same place. Lovely ideas, and we can commit ourselves to ideas, but at the end of the day, ideas are important, but they're not enough.
Fazal, please.
Just want to say, I agree that that UNESCO has always struggled to move beyond its progressive language, and it has had consistently progressive language. So its progressive language is not new. It's had that for quite some time. And yet, at the same time, it has had difficulty taking it to the next step. One of the problems is, of course, in the formation of those progressive ideas, it has had to accommodate all kinds of conflicting ideas coming from its member states. And as a result, you have to somehow rather come up with a compromise language. And that compromise language inevitably is articulated in a space of asymmetries of power. And that is one of the problems about trying to come up with reports that have progressive sentiments, but ultimately they're accommodating a lot more as well. I was thinking about a distinction that one of the commissioners, Arjuna Pudarai, drew in his book, Culture as Future as Cultural Fact, a distinction between ethics of probability and ethics of possibility. Okay, quite a useful little distinction. Actually, one suggests that we are caught in thinking about our futures within, on the one hand, trying to do it efficiently, where we try to use all the statistics, all the data machinery, and all the other things to actually predict the future and then shape our future in terms of the that prediction. And on the other hand, we have a democratic dialogue of the kind that is being proposed by this report, of possibilities. So exactly how we hold these two things together is a major question that I'm not sure whether the report has been able to resolve, at least not in my mind, as I read it, as to how it was dealing with this distinction between two kinds of futures: future that is predicted, an ethic that is predicted, an ethic that is possible.
Thank you very much, all of you, for the comments. Of course, we could keep on discussing this, and it's probably one of the main issues here, but here's another question that is very linked to this discussion, and it comes from the audience. Again, it's how do we transform the way we measure education systems at a global level, for example, PISA. This seems key to giving local policymakers license to think about a change in direction. Which again, in a way, goes to a very specific question about assessment, but also about measurement, prediction, the future. And so I don't know if anyone wants to start with that, answering that.
I can dive in there.
Okay.
I actually think we should get rid of these, well, I call it vertical vision, seeing the world always, in a kind of ordinal way, winners and losers. So one thing we could do, and it would help us immediately, is to get rid of the plethora of different kinds of rankings and arrive at a different way of actually trying to think about not kind of competitive comparison, but actually thinking very differently about how we look at education systems. What does learning begin to look like? What does, let's say, the compassionate child begin to look like? I'm a governor of a primary school that's attached to the university here in Cambridge, and they're squarely at the middle of the idea for that child is a child that is creative, compassionate, and is able to engage in dialogue. So the question then is, what does that begin to look like? Not the competitive child, but actually the compassionate child. And how would we begin to make sense of the kind of progress in that school? And actually the school head and the teachers in that school actually do monitor and provide us, and be a lovely, Noah, case study of actually what's possible. There are parents that take their children out of that school and think that it's not the kind of school that they actually want for their child. And what they're actually looking for in the Cambridge setting is privately educated, getting ready for the kind of elite formation and so on. But dismantling rankings would be a really first important move. Partly they're expensive. We know typically they don't do what they say they do on the tin, and in fact incredibly destructive.
Yeah, actually, if I can say something, not as chair, but as a comment, I think one of the things I found really interesting in the report, I mean, I know most of you mentioned this, and I agree that UNESCO, writing from its own position, is kind of I'm doing a literal translation from Spanish, kind of a washed language where they cannot be very critical of who's responsible of this or that. But I think what I found really interesting is that it does criticize the rankings, and it's a kind of in this competition between to put it in a way, between the trying to reassert the humanist position in front of the very market-driven logic of the OECD and the World Bank that are dominant, and the companies. I found that really interesting, where it seemed to me that that UNESCO really there was willing to really put their hands down there, no? And I found it really interesting.
Yeah, I just wanted to just quickly come in and make that point. The report, I think the commission was pretty clear that assessment needs not to be used in these punitive ways, needs not to be creating winners and losers, needs to be recognized as pedagogical, as Susan's points got at, and we need to move away from this excessive priority placed on high stakes, decentralized examination, because they put disproportionate pressure on what happens in schools. Absolutely. I think that's quite clear in the report.
Anyone? Raven, do you want to add something?
Sure. It strikes me that we don't have to talk about getting rid of evaluation and assessment in order to reject the current competitive apparatus and all its destructive consequences. I mean, evaluation and assessment can be useful in school practice. Often schools, often know how to do this quite well, quite productively. And it strikes me that a crucial feature of the competitive ranking schemes is the way they abstract from the real life situations in which education is occurring, and attempt to produce information about a system on the cheap, and therefore with basically very poor data, which is my fundamental criticism of the ranking systems. They're mostly technically crap. But these are functions. Evaluation and assessment are legitimate functions in education. We need to put them back in the hands of the people for whom they are useful, which is the learners and the teachers and the organisations such as schools, which are actually doing the job, and resource them to do it well.
I agree absolutely, that assessment and evaluation have useful purposes to serve in particular context, in particular ways. One of the problems, of course, that has occurred over not only in recent decades, but perhaps going back to the 50s, is the development of testing industry, which is basically so powerful now, and yet goes under the radar, so to speak. And of course, ETS and other institutions like that are totally committed to a particular kind of standardized testing, because that's what industrial systems do. They standardize products, and yet evaluation of the kind that I'm assuming that Raven is talking about is quite specific to the local circumstances, local conditions, and local teacher-student relations. And that's the problem with PISA. PISA is too big, too unwieldy, and therefore too destructive. So it's the industrialization of the testing system that we need to actually look at very carefully and see how it has done damage. It probably emerged out of army or military forces or something like that in the 1940s and 50s, and has now become so large that quite often it dwarfs educational systems and controls them in ways that are really quite destructive.
Thank you all for your comments. Susan, there's one specific comment that you might, just a short, well, you can do a long answer to this if you want, but someone saying, what does the compassionate child look like? I love that, says Matt Connet. And I was thinking maybe you can point to somewhere where they can find out more about what the institution you were mentioning, or is there something online about that?
So the school I'm referring to is a school that I'm a governor of, but it's the first primary school that's attached to a university in England, actually, and it started with a very explicit objective. The head teacher has actually had to look at how he and the school actually run the gamut of the Ofsted inspections to try and keep this notion of the compassionate child right at the centre. So this would be, they would be gather data, so observation, qualitative on children and how they interact together. So they construct right from nursery right through different kinds of activities, pedagogical, creative, but where they're placing that at the centre. So as a school governor who's got legal responsibilities, one of my jobs is actually to be in the school quite regularly and to actually look at the ways in which notions of compassion, teacher to child, different people who are in the school and so on, that's actually at work and at play. And so it seems to me that becomes a really interesting question of how do we actually represent changes, a kind of forward direction in levels of compassion and so on. For the head teacher, that comes out of a kind of Buddhist philosophy. And in fact, I just want to reflect here on Nehru. And it was a UNESCO meeting in India, and Nehru closes the meeting, I think it was in 1947, of this UNESCO meeting, so not long after UNESCO gets going. And he reflects, reflects on the limitations fundamentally of the UNESCO project, its strong commitment to science, scientific humanism and so on. And he basically says, he worries about the question of being and spirituality, and as the opposite then to the cognitive direction that he thought UNESCO was kind of committing itself to. So my sense about the idea of the compassionate child, and actually looking around and looking at schools around the world that might embrace this, would be actually to also prioritize and privilege that set of practices. When we see these kinds of kind of visions, philosophy running the everyday life of that school, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it feel like to be a child in that school, to be a learner in that school, to be a teacher in that school? And my sense is it's different to a highly competitive kind of environment.
Thanks, Susan, for that. Seems that you have a fascinating job there, at least in that aspect. Really would be really nice to see that school. Here we have another question from the audience. And actually it's very linked to the discussion we're just having. And they say, could collaboration and competition coexist? Or is there intent of collaboration merely a mask to facilitate competitive behaviors? Well, I think there's two different questions, but I don't know if someone wants to address that. Fazal?
Well, I mean, there is elements of competition always, and we cannot actually sort of assume that human beings do not compete, but it's the nature of competition that we need to focus on. In other words, the broader context in which certain competitions are okay, but other competitions should be discouraged. So as a result, I think the two broad categories, competition and collaboration, conjure up a whole range of different kinds of images, some extreme and some not so extremes. Not so extremes can be reconciled. Extremes ones cannot be reconciled. I mean, just as Susan is working with a school in Cambridge, where she's a governor, I have been for the past 12 months been working with a school in Bhutan. Online, of course, because I haven't been able to go there. But I've been talking to people, teachers, principals, and it's a place that has been established in order to develop a very radically different kinds of education system. It's called the Royal Academy of Bhutan, and they're trying to develop a thing called Bhutan Baccalaureate, which is structured around 5 different dimensions of education: the cognitive or cerebral, physical, emotional, social, and spiritual. And it argues, the program argues, that all of those 5 can not only coexist, but must coexist and relate to each other constantly. So the cerebral is not only about cognitive, but about other matters as well. And I have to say, while they have all kinds of problems, they are trying to develop some interesting things in relation to what is possible. And the question about collaboration and competition emerges all the time because they have games which are competitive. They have all kinds of competition that is going on amongst kids, despite the fact that it's discouraged, etc., etc. So they've come to decide that the question is not whether there should be competition, but what kind of competition is destructive. what kind of competition should be discouraged, and what kind of competition should be prevented, if at all possible. So I think that's actually the ways I think it is possible to think about the two concepts, not as an absolute binary, but heuristically different concepts, but related and reconcilable in some ways, but not in other ways.
Noah, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, Fazal actually just said it quite well. I mean, what you just said, Fazal, I think is the spirit of what was intended in the report. Not to discounting competition, of course, not to discount the importance of individual achievement, individual flourishing, but to make sure that we at the same time pay attention to the supporting structures, and we not just that enable things like compassion, that enable cooperation, because there are structures that enable competition, right? And we need to carefully think about the role we want them to play.
Listen, can I just say, I mean, competition was actually the economist's answer to generating efficiencies. Okay? And my sense is, it's generated a Hobbesian world of all against all in many senses, and finding our way back to a slightly different kind of place with a more enlightened state, a kind of Lockean world potentially, where the excesses of the state releasing on the one hand way more market, and on the other hand essentially, at least in the case of the UK, specifically England, a highly indebted kind of population because of the way in which it's actually gotten into bed basically with the big corporation. So I would like to see, and this gets back to the question that Raywin and Fazal also kind of raised about what kind of political structures, decent forms of taxation, for example, responsive politicians around other kinds of political agendas other than an excessive competition that actually create the decent society. And so it's those political structures, I think, that we sorely need. And Raywin, I agree with you. This means that we do get back the different unions, get involved in campaigning, and as public intellectuals, people in the academy, actually trying to do that. I've been, where am I going now? I'm going into a meeting that is caught between the DFE and Number 10, and we've been out there and we've been campaigning, and actually I think making some progress around getting rid of a really ill-imagined, conceived initial teacher training offer. But that's meant that we've built a coalition here in England. We have been on the case day after day, week after week, and not going to give up. And I think it's across the board, and actually amongst our young learners, it's that kind of sense of a degree of outrage, actually, that in fact the political structures that we have don't serve us well. They don't create the decent society. They are marked by a profound sense of disrespect for human beings, and we need to change that.
Thanks, Susan. Raven, you want to add something to this?
I could not improve on that.
Okay. So as we are coming to an end, there's one more question here, but I think it's quite on that kind of similar question of when so much of our social discourse is framed by the priority of money, including in education. How does collaboration and social contract play out? So I think that's more or less, I mean, we have the issue of money, but I think that it has been mentioned. Noah, I wanted to ask you a question, if I may, as we are arriving to the end. Again, I'm very, as you know, I'm very interested in understanding the politics and geopolitics within these global spaces and discussion. I was wondering if in this process of producing this report or the whole futures of education, you had any interactions with organizations such as the OECD or the World Bank, and how these ideas have been received by them?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the there's an advisory board. We have a whole process and modality for this. An advisory board with key partners, working in the international education space, includes the bank, includes the OECD. So they were regularly involved in these conversations. That those key partners also include Education International, which is an association of teacher trade associations, teacher unions. And I think the report speaks, my view, pretty consistently, but not uniformly. And there was, certainly among the commission and among the people advising, differences of opinion. But I think that at least among the 17 members of the commission who authored the final piece, some kind of consensus and agreement to disagree prevailed. As Susan said, with reference to the OECD, I mean, there's more going on there than is typically sometimes in some of the academic literature recognized. And I think we need to say the same about the bank. I mean, sometimes I feel that people are criticizing, the World Bank circa 2005, and the bank has changed too. But I mean, let me just close by saying there was also a definite commitment to making this and recognized by partners, with the bank, with OECD, saying, this is a UNESCO report. It needs to put into the conversation what UNESCO brings to that conversation. And the hope, exactly as Raywin says, is that this is a document that people can refer to, they can draw on, and then build upon. So I'll close with that.
Thank you, Noah, very much. And I think I'm aware of time, and we're gonna go. We're gonna start finishing. And I want to start by thank the panelists very much. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Fazal. Thank you, Raven. I mean, you've been wonderful. And I think we had a great discussion. I think, I mean, I wanted to finish with an idea. I think our discussion went very much to which I think it's really important and very relevant on okay, so how do we bring down these ideas into actual political action? But I also would like to highlight that I was quite impressed on how this group of very critical scholars, and I know your work very well, were very impressed and positively impressed by the philosophy and the approach of UNESCO's report. And I want to celebrate that in a way, because I think, and I think the words of Susan saying it's so, I don't know if I say them exactly like that, but it's so nice to read these kind of words in a global policy document, and we've been missing a little bit of that. So in a way, of course, this is to a certain extent utopian, and I want to finish with something that a very famous Uruguayan poet wrote some time ago about utopia. His name is Eduardo Galeano, and he said, "Utopia lies at the horizon. When I draw nearer by 2 steps, it retreats 2 steps. If I proceed 10 steps forward, it swiftly slips 10 steps ahead. No matter how far I go, I can never reach it." What then is the purpose of utopia? Its purpose is precisely that, to make us walk. So hopefully we can take forward these beautiful words of Eduardo Galeano, and this UNESCO report can contribute to discussions and to more humanistic and more progressive views of education, and we can think of a real change in how we think about our world and our educational futures.